Edward L. Thorndike. Thorndike was born in 1874 and died in 1949. He was the son of a Methodist minister, and he, like many other prominent psychologists, was influenced by a book by William James called The Principles of Psychology. His Ph.D. dissertation on animal intelligence is regarded as the foundation of all experimental studies of human behavior. This dissertation was ultimately published in 1898 and was called Animal Intelligence, an Experimental Study of the Associative Processes in Animals. Thorndike was a prolific and creative writer, and in his lifetime he published over 500 books, monographs, and articles covering such things as educational measurement, learning theory, transfer of training, intelligence, the nature-nurture problem, and verbal learning. In his later years, he even turned to the measurement of qualities of cities and states and attempted to develop scales that would measure the quality of life in one city or state as opposed to another. All his work emphasized factual conclusions. He was very impatient with conclusions that could not be substantiated by experimental evidence. He was considered by his students to be a warm, friendly, humorous, and witty individual, but quick to criticize mistakes. Although we remember Thorndike as a very objective individual, it is interesting to note that his first experiments were on the study of mental telepathy in small children, but he quickly turned from this to the investigation of intelligence in chickens, and this caused him all kinds of problems. His landlady refused to let Thorndike incubate and hatch chickens in his bedroom, so he moved the whole operation to the basement in William James's house. While he was doing his work on chickens, he was also doing tutoring in order to pay his way through school, and he packed his chickens along with him when he went on his tutoring assignments. This became awkward, so he later turned from chickens to cats and dogs. It has been said that all learning theorists today start with some part of Thorndike's work. Some theories may agree, some disagree, but they all deal with something that originated with Thorndike in their theorizing. Although his most influential work came out in 1898, and although Thorndike died 9 years after his retirement in 1949, we shouldn't think of him as having only historical value. Many of Thorndike's ideas are still very much alive, and it's not uncommon as you go through the experimental journals in psychology to find a reference to some aspect of his work even today. Thorndike called the association between sense impressions and impulses to action a bond or a connection. This made his theory the original stimulus-response theory. If you substitute for the term sense impression the word stimulus, and if you substitute for impulses to action the word response, you have a stimulus response or an SR theory. However, Thorndike's concern was not only for the stimulating conditions and for the tendencies to action or responses, but he was also concerned with what held the two together. He believed they were connected by some kind of a neural bond. That is why Thorndike's theory of learning is referred to as a connectionism. The connection that is being referred to is the neural bond between the S and the R, or between the stimulus and the response. The most characteristic form of learning for all animals is trial and error learning, or what Thorndike originally called selecting and connecting. He reached his basic notion of trial and error learning through his early experimentation, which involved putting an animal in an apparatus that was arranged so that when the animal made a certain kind of a response, the animal escaped from the apparatus. The apparatus was a small box with a pole sticking up from the middle of it, or a chain hanging down from the ceiling. Different responses were called for at different times in Thorndike's experimentation, but the idea was always the same, that there was one thing the animal could do that would allow him to escape from the box. Thorndike would plot the time it took the animal to solve the problem as a function of the number of opportunities the animal had to solve the problem. Every opportunity was a trial, and the trial terminated when the animal hit upon the correct solution. This generated a graph indicating the time it took the animal to solve the problem as a function of successive trials. Again, each trial was terminated when the animal hit upon the solution, and the time it took for him to solve the problem was noted. From this basic experimental idea, Thorndike noted consistently that the time to solution, which was his dependent variable, systematically went down as successive trials went up. The more opportunities the animal had to solve the problem, the less time it took him to do so. Looking at this function and noting the slow downward trend of time to solution as a function of successive trials, Thorndike concluded that learning for all animals, including humans, is incremental rather than insightful. That is, learning occurs, according to Thorndike, in very small, systematic steps rather than in huge hunks. He noted that if learning was insightful, that is, if it occurred in huge hunks, the graph would show that the time to solution would remain relatively stable and high during the time that the animal was in the unlearned state. In other words, the pre-solution portion of the graph would remain more or less the same until somewhere along the line the animal would have what might be referred to as a burst of insight, and at that point the graph indicating the time to solution would drop very rapidly and would remain at that point for as long as the experiment continued. This, however, was not the case. There was no rapid drop in any of Thorndike's graphs indicating insightful learning. Rather, it was a slow downward trend. The times to solution became smaller and smaller as the number of successive trials went up. He also concluded from his work that learning was not mediated by ideas, and we must remember that he was talking about human learning as well. Learning does not involve thinking or reasoning. It is direct. Learning occurs because of the strengthening of a connection between stimulating conditions and certain responses, and this learning need not involve any mediational or ideational process at all. Thorndike's thinking concerning the learning process can be divided into two parts. One part consisting of his thoughts prior to 1930, and the second part concerning his thoughts after 1930. Before 1930, his system included, among other things, the law of readiness. The law of readiness was proposed in his book entitled The Original Nature of Man, which was published in 1913. The law of readiness had three parts, and they are as follows. 1. When a conduction unit is ready to conduct, conduction by it is satisfying. 2. For a conduction unit ready to conduct, not to conduct is annoying. And 3. When a conduction unit is not ready for conduction and is forced to conduct, conduction is annoying. We notice some terms here that may disturb the modern experimental psychologist. We must keep in mind, however, that Thorndike was writing before behaviorism became popular. Many of the things that Thorndike wrote about had never been systematically analyzed before, so we must allow him some leeway. It is also important to note that sometimes what sounds to be a very subjective term in actuality is not as subjective as it sounds. For example, what Thorndike meant by a conduction unit is merely an action tendency, a preparedness for action, a goal-directedness, terms which are perfectly acceptable today. In another sense, Thorndike really didn't care what a conduction unit was. It was a hypothetical term. Today we would call it a hypothetical construct. It was something that Thorndike postulated to hold his theory together. He did imply at times, however, that this conduction unit, whatever it was, actually existed, that it was there, that it was anatomical. Although he didn't know exactly where it was or what it was, he did believe it to be there. Today we would say that his belief in its ultimate reality makes it a hypothetical construct as opposed to an intervening variable. If he merely postulated this conduction unit and gave it some kind of mathematical formulation and did not state further that he felt that it existed, that it was tangible, then it would be an intervening variable. The distinction between a hypothetical construct and an intervening variable is a very fine one. Some researchers feel it is an important distinction to make, and others do not. Before 1930, his system also included the law of exercise, which had two parts. The first part is as follows. Connections between a stimulus and a response are strengthened as they are used. Merely exercising the connection or bond between an S and an R strengthens the connection between the stimulus and that response. This is the part of the law of exercise called the law of use. The second part of the law of exercise states that connections between an S and an R are weakened when practice is discontinued, that is, if the bond is not used. Another way of saying this is that the connection between a stimulus and a response is forgotten when that bond connecting the two is no longer used. This is the portion of the law of exercise called the law of disuse. What did Thorndike mean by strengthening or weakening? Here again, he was way ahead of his time, and on this issue he could be speaking today. Strengthening for him is defined by the increase in probability that the response will be made when the stimulus recurs. So if the bond between a stimulus and a response is strengthened, it means that the next time the stimulus occurs, there is an increased probability that the response will occur. If the bond is weakened, there is a decreased probability that the next time the stimulus occurs, the response will occur. It should be noted that the first part of the law of exercise, when we were talking about Thorndike's theory before 1930, implies that we simply learn by doing. Nothing else is important. That is, we strengthen the bonds between an S and an R simply by repeating them. Next we turn to Thorndike's law of effect. The law of effect before 1930 refers to the strengthening or weakening of a connection between an S and an R as a result of its consequences. For example, if a response is followed by a satisfying state of affairs, the strength of the connection is increased. The second part of the law of effect before 1930 states that if a response is followed by an annoying state of affairs, its strength is decreased. So the law of effect states that, putting it in modern terminology, if an S leads to an R, which in turn leads to reward, the connection between the S and the R is strengthened. If, on the other hand, an S leads to an R, which in turn leads to an annoying state of affairs, or punishment, then the bond or connection between that S and that R is weakened. Here we have another example of Thorndike using what seems to be highly subjective terminology. For example, satisfying state of affairs, or annoying state of affairs. But by satisfying state of affairs, he merely meant something for which the organism made no effort to avoid, or even made an effort to maintain. A satisfying state of affairs is something that you attempt to prolong and in no way attempt to terminate or avoid. An annoying state of affairs is something that you attempt to terminate and will avoid. So the terms aren't nearly as subjective as they first may seem. Many people wondered at the time that Thorndike was formulating his ideas, and many are still wondering, how an effect, whether it's satisfying or annoying, having once occurred, can work back in time on the connection or bond. It's an interesting question and one that you may want to ponder. It's still a problem, but it didn't seem to bother Thorndike, and it doesn't seem to bother modern learning theorists either. Before 1930, Thorndike had a number of secondary ideas that were part of his theory, but they were not nearly as important as the law of readiness, the law of effect, and the law of exercise. Among these subordinate ideas was the notion of multiple response, which meant merely that varied responses must occur before trial and error learning can occur. There must be a variety of responses that occur in a learning situation so that the process of selecting and connecting can take place. He also talked about set or attitude. He believed that a person's set or attitude determined what will satisfy or annoy that person in a learning situation. Here again he was very much ahead of his time by taking into consideration individual differences in determining what would be a reward and what would be a punishment for a given individual. Today we might call this the level of aspiration. Level of aspiration determines for a given individual what will be interpreted as successful and what will be interpreted as failure. He also talked about prepotency of elements, which refers to the ability of the learner to selectively attend to certain things in the environment and to neglect others. Prepotency of elements, or selective attention, can be considered the sensory side of multiple response, and it, too, is a prerequisite to trial and error learning. We must be able to make discriminations among things in the environment before we can select and connect. Thorndike's secondary notions before 1930 also included response by analogy, which meant that we respond in a new situation, in a situation that we have never experienced before, as we would respond to a situation similar to the new one that we have experienced previously. Many people wanted to know how one was able to respond to a new situation with relative smoothness, without disruption in our ongoing activities. They felt that our ability to do this was in fact a criticism of Thorndike, and Thorndike felt to the contrary. He felt that our ability to respond smoothly to novel situations provided support for his theory. We merely respond to a novel situation, he said, as we would respond to a situation like it that we have learned about. If the new situation is completely unlike anything that we have ever experienced, then we would revert to trial and error learning. Today, we would call response by analogy stimulus generalization. Thorndike also talked about associative shifting, which is very much like classical conditioning, only Thorndike considered classical conditioning to be a specific case of associative shifting. If a response can be kept intact through a number of changes in the stimulating conditions, then that response may finally be given to an entirely new stimulus. In teaching a dog to do a trick, like sitting up, we have something he wants, like food, and we guide his behavior while saying things like sit up, or jump, or whatever. The words, like sit up, and the behavior of sitting up are paired together. Then we gradually fade certain elements of the stimulus complex, such as the food, and at the end of the training, the dog is sitting up merely to the word sit up. This, to Thorndike, would be an example of associative shifting. The same response is kept intact through a number of stimulus changes, and finally is given to a stimulus which is unlike the stimulus that originally caused the behavior. That is, the animal first sat up for the food, and finally to the words sit up alone. Also in his early writings before 1930, Thorndike talked about the doctrine of specificity, which was his attempt to relate his theoretical notions about the learning process to practical things like teaching. In his doctrine of specificity, Thorndike says that before the notions we described above can be applied to the practical learning situation, the teacher must know clearly what it is she wants the learner to learn. She must be able to divide a complex skill into its individual components so that she can apply satisfiers and annoyers at the appropriate time. If the teacher does not divide a skill into its component parts, she may not be administering a satisfier when she should, or she may be administering an annoyer when she shouldn't be. So the teacher must know what it is she wants to achieve before she starts teaching. Thorndike claimed that the doctrine of specificity allowed the teacher to roll up her sleeves and get to work. The doctrine can be as easily applied today as it was in Thorndike's time. Today we ask teachers to behaviorally define the objectives of their courses, that is, to state in behavioral terms what they are trying to get the class to learn. This is a very difficult task, but to Thorndike and to many since him, a very important one. It was also before 1930 when Thorndike proposed his now famous theory of transfer of training. He believed that all schools and all activities in school ultimately were concerned, or should be concerned, with the transfer of training. He felt that whatever was taking place in the classroom was taking place specifically to get a person to do something differently out in the real world, outside of the classroom. There has to be some transfer of training from the schoolroom situation to a situation outside the schoolroom. The heart of Thorndike's theory of transfer consisted of the idea that transfer depended upon the presence of identical elements in the original learning and in the new learning situation. To the extent that there were identical elements in the original learning and in the new learning, there will be transfer of training. As the number of identical elements goes up, the amount of transfer goes up. That is, the more similar the two situations are, the greater will be the amount of transfer. These elements may be in substance, that is, they may actually be stimulus conditions, or they may be in procedure. An example of a procedure transfer would be that learning to look things up in school may transfer to a variety of situations outside of school that have nothing to do with the exact thing you were looking up in the classroom, but the ability to look things up may transfer. This would be the transfer of procedure rather than of substance. Learning to pay attention for long periods of time and learning to be punctual would also be examples of the transfer of procedures rather than of stimuli. Thorndike's identical element theory of transfer was revolutionary because up until the time that he proposed it, the formal discipline notion prevailed. Formal discipline has also been called the mental muscle approach because the notion that the mind was divided into certain components or faculties was accepted. Those accepting the doctrine of formal discipline believed that part of the mind was for reasoning, part was for imagination, another part was for creativity, another part was for friendliness, and so forth, and that these faculties were strengthened by exercise. According to this point of view, if you wanted a child to be reasonable when he left school, you would force him to exercise his reasoning faculty while he was in school. Based on this idea, the child would be forced to study the most difficult topics the teacher could find, like Latin and mathematics. The teacher of that day believed that solving difficult problems forced the child to use the reasoning component of his mind, and therefore he would be better able to reason outside the school. Because the mental muscle approach assumed the existence of specific faculties in the mind, it has also been referred to as faculty psychology. It was the belief in mental muscles and its associated technique of formal discipline that was attacked by Thorndike's identical element theory of transfer of training. Next, we turn to Thorndike after 1930. In September of 1929, Thorndike stood before the International Congress of Psychologists and started his address by saying, "I was wrong," and that launched the second half of Thorndike's theorizing. Now we will discuss Thorndike's theory of learning after 1930, or after his address before the International Congress of Psychologists. The law of exercise, as we described it previously, was almost completely renounced. The law of use essentially no longer existed. He found that practice alone did nothing to strengthen a neural bond. The law of disuse essentially no longer existed, although Thorndike still held out for a little forgetting because of lack of practice. But for all practical purposes, the law of exercise was discarded altogether after 1930. After 1930, the law of effect remained only half true. The half that was salvaged was the half that stated that a response followed by a satisfactory state of affairs was strengthened. On the other hand, an annoying state of affairs following a response had no effect on the probability of that response reoccurring. In other words, reward increases the strength of a connection, but punishment does nothing to the strength of a connection. This probably was the most profound change in Thorndike's theory, and this change was based upon an enormous amount of experimental evidence. Punishing response did nothing to change the probability of that response reoccurring. This was a profound finding then, and it is a profound finding now. Punishment does, however, have an indirect effect on behavior. If you punish a response, it leads the organism to do something else, and when he does, the other half of the law of effect can be utilized. That is, punishment directs the organism's attention away from the behavior that you don't want it to engage in. And while he is doing something else, he can be rewarded, thereby increasing the probability of his doing something other than what it was originally punished for doing. In his theory after 1930, Thorndike included another major theoretical concept called the spread of effect. Thorndike found that a satisfying state of affairs not only increased the probability of the response that led to the satisfying state of affairs, but there is also an increased probability of the responses surrounding the rewarded one. One typical experiment demonstrating this effect is when the experimenter calls out a word and the subject is to respond with a number. It's entirely arbitrary from the subject's point of view. He is just instructed to say a number when the experimenter says a word. At some preconceived place, the experimenter will say correct, or that's right, when the subject says a certain number to a certain word, and they'll run through a series of word-number combinations. Sometimes when a subject says a number in response to a word, the experimenter will say correct, and sometimes he will say incorrect or wrong. What is noticed in this experiment is the increased probability of the subject saying a certain number because it is rewarded. But in addition to that, it was found that the numbers that preceded and followed that number, the one that was rewarded, also increased in probability of recurring, even though when they occurred, the experimenter may have said wrong. So the effect of what we now call positive reinforcement or reward, or what Thorndike called a satisfying state of affairs, spills over from the rewarded response to neighboring responses, and this is what he called the spread of effect. So three main changes occurred in Thorndike's theory after 1930. Essentially, he threw out the law of exercise. He maintained only one half of the law of effect, saying something that was almost unbelievable at the time and is still somewhat unbelievable to those unaware of the experimental evidence to support the contention, that punishing a response does nothing to increase or decrease the probability of that response occurring again. The third major change was the inclusion of the spread of effect. What then does Thorndike say about things like capacity, intelligence, and creativity? For Thorndike, it is a matter of the number of neural bonds or the number of connections available to the organism. The smarter the person, the more neural bonds he has. Also, the person with a relatively large number of neural bonds is the more creative person. To summarize Thorndike's main points, practice alone means nothing. Only practice with reward is effective. What does he say about understanding? Practically nothing. He minimizes understanding. You will remember that learning took place, as far as Thorndike was concerned, at the neurological level. It was a direct thing and was not mediated by ideas or thinking. How does he explain transfer of training? He explains transfer through his identical elements theory. All through his writings, Thorndike insisted upon objectivity in measurement. As we noted earlier, he was very impatient with people drawing conclusions about the learning process based on either wishful thinking or scientifically unfounded notions. That is, notions for which there was no experimental evidence. His doctrine of specificity tells the teacher to know first of all what it is she wants to teach, and then knowing this in behavioral terms to apply the necessary satisfiers. He would urge concentration on satisfiers and say forget the annoyers. In other words, when what you want from a student occurs, you reward him. And according to Thorndike, that will increase the probability of that behavior occurring again. Therefore, one has a great deal of control over the learning process in the classroom. If you generalize slightly from this point of view, from the doctrine of specificity and the use of positive reward, you would come very close to the position taken currently by B.F. Skinner. It is really upon this notion of the systematic management of learning in the classroom and the systematic application of positive reinforcers that all programmed learning and the use of teaching machines is based. Skinner, who has been mainly responsible for the development of programmed learning, can be considered a modern disciple of the great Edward L. Thorndike. And with that, we will conclude our discussion of Thorndike's theory of learning.